To live in the hearts we leave behind is not to die. Thomas Campbell. Hey guys, my name is Divya and I'm a storyteller. I belong to a group called the Storytellers Pune, and if you want to know more about them, there's a link in the description below. So let's get to our story then. Sophie's face faded in the grey winter light of her sitting room. She was fast asleep on the armchair that Joe had gifted her on their 40th anniversary. Inside, it was warm and quiet. Outside, it was snowing a little. At 1:15, the mailman turned into Allen Street. He was running a little behind schedule today. Not because of the snow, but because it was Valentine's Day and there was more mail than usual. He passed under Sophie's house without looking up. After about 20 minutes, he got into his truck and drove away. Sophie stirred. She took off her glasses, took the handkerchief that she always keeps at her sleeve and wiped her eyes. She wiped her mouth, and then slowly, with the help of the arms of the chair, she got off the chair, straightened the crease that was formed on her lap of her green house dress, and then started walking towards the kitchen. Her slippers made this soft sound as she walked. She then washed the 2 dishes that she had left at the counter after lunch, filled a plastic cup half with water, took her pills, all this, and now it was 1:45. She then went towards the window where there was a rocker kept. She sat into the rocker and waited for the children. She knew that in some time the children would pass from under her house from school to home. So she sat there rocking and waiting. And as always, the boys came first, laughing, shouting out each other's names, shouting out things that Sophie didn't understand. But today they were playing with snowballs. So they made these snowballs and they tossed it at each other. One missed and it went smack at Sophie's window and she jolted back as her rocker slipped off the oval rug. She then peeped out of the window again, and there came the girls, dilly-dallying, laughing in pairs and groups of 3, and they were beautiful, and all their laughter, and they were cupping their faces with their mittened hands, and Sophie wondered if these children were talking about the Valentines they received that day. One of the girls spotted Sophie and pointed in her direction. Sophie suddenly hid behind the drapes, so self-conscious. When she looked out again, the children were gone. And even though it was cold, she sat at the window, watching the snow cover the footsteps of the children. After some time, a flour truck turned into Allen Street. It was moving very slowly. It halted several times until finally it came to a halt in front of Mrs. Mason's house. Oh, who got Mrs. Mason flowers? Sophie thought. Is it her daughter in Wisconsin? Or is it her brother? But the brother has been very ill, so it must be the daughter. How nice. Flowers reminded Sophie of Joe. She allowed that aching pain to fill her up. Tomorrow it would be the 15th. It would be 8 months since Joe died. The flower delivery guy knocked at Mrs. Mason's house, but Mrs. Mason didn't answer. Oh yes, she goes quilting in the church on Fridays. So he looked around and he started walking towards Sophie's house. Sophie slowly stood up. With trembling hands, she straightened her hair and then started walking towards the door. On the 3rd knock, she opened the door and said, "Yes?" He asked, "Would you take a parcel for your neighbor, madam?" To which she opened the door and said, "Yes," and pointed towards the table. She looked at this man. He looked so big to Sophie, and between the green hat and his beard, she couldn't make out much of his features. He placed the box, greeted her and left, and she was so glad that he left. She locked the door behind her and turned towards the table. And there was the box. She looked over at it. It was green and white, and on it was written Natalie's Flowers for All Occasions. She breathed in slowly, letting the fragrance of the roses fill her. Yellow roses. Joe always chose yellow roses. He would give her this extravagant bouquet of yellow roses and smile and say, "To my sunshine." And then he would kiss her on the forehead, take her hands and sing, "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray." Mrs. Mason knocked at the door at 5 p.m. Sophie didn't answer. She didn't hear. She sat there. Now the box was open and the flowers were on her lap. And she gently stroked the petals of those roses. Mrs. Mason knocked again. She didn't hear. After a while, Mrs. Mason left. Some time later, Sophie got up. She kept the flowers on the table and she headed towards the kitchen counter. She dragged the step stool across it, climbed on it, and took off a huge porcelain vase. With her plastic cup, she filled the vase with water and then beautifully arranged the flowers and the greens in it. And as she picked up the vase and started walking, midway she smiled. And then she dipped and she turned and she swayed and she dipped and she turned and she danced into the hall, into the kitchen, into the sitting room and back. And when her legs got very tired, she plonked herself into the armchair and went off to sleep. At 6:15, Sophie suddenly awoke to this knocking sound at her back door. She opened the door and it was Mrs. Mason. She said, "Hello, Sophie, how are you? I was a little worried about you. I came to your house at 5 p.m. but nobody answered. Were you sleeping?" She kept chattering as she rubbed her boots on the welcome mat right outside her house. And then she stepped in and said, "Oh, I hate the snow. You know, in the radio they were saying tonight it's going to snow at about 6-7 inches. I don't believe the radio. Do you remember last year? They said about 4 inches and it snowed 21 inches. 21! And now they say mild winter. There wasn't a single day when the temperature was above 0. Sophie suddenly remembered Mrs. Mason's flowers. The fact that she had opened the box and kept it that way. What was she going to say to Mrs. Mason? She turned red in embarrassment. You know what my bill was? Last month my bill was $263 for my little house. Oh, I don't know how I'm going to go about. Only if my Alfred was as careful with money as your Joseph, God bless his soul. Oh, Joseph, that reminded me. Did you get the roses?" Sophie's cheeks started burning. She didn't know what to say. She started muttering her apology and she stepped aside to show the box that was empty on the table. And that's when Mrs. Mason said, "Oh, you placed the flowers in water. That's good. So you read the letter. I hope it didn't startle you to see Joseph's handwriting. I mean, he wanted me to bring these flowers to you for the first time so that he could explain himself. He had arranged it with the florist, last April or so. His flower trust, he says. Ah, such a good man, your Joseph." Sophie stopped listening. She rushed towards the table to see that white envelope that she had so easily missed the first time. She opened it and there, in her own Joe's handwriting, it was written, "To my sunshine, I love you with all my heart. Try to be happy whenever you think of me. Love, Joe. So, the name of the story is Thinking of You by Alicia Vaughan Stamwitz. I hope I'm pronouncing this name right. So, huge shout out to Alicia Vaughan Stamwitz. It's an excellent story. I came across this story in a book called The Chicken Soup for the Lover's Soul, and I instantly fell in love with it. This is very similar to my previous story, if you see, but there is one aspect that is very different, and that aspect is something that screams out to you from the start to the end of the story. That thing is her loneliness. You see, for many people who have experienced a personal loss, you might be having people around you who tell you that, you know what, we know what you feel and we are here with you. But do they really understand what you feel? You might be surrounded by a gazillion people and you could still be extremely lonely because you miss that one person so much. The rest of your days are spent just with that little void in your chest, that lump in your throat, and it's going to stay there for good. The pain might reduce with time, but it never goes away. So this is something that really stood out and really touched me. Is there anything about the story that appealed to you? Or is there anything that this story reminded you of in your own personal life? Do let me know. Leave it in the comment section below. I love reading your comments. Alright, so that's that. I will now take your leave. I will see you next week again with a new story. Do like, share, and subscribe if you please. And I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.